Imagine a world of unimaginable wealth, where the grandest mansions in New York stood as monuments to power, and family names carried more weight than gold. This was the Gilded Age, a time of opulence, ambition, and ruthless social climbing, but beneath the glittering surface of high society lurked secrets, betrayals, and bitter rivalries that could tear even the most powerful families apart. And no family embodied this drama more than the Astors, America's royalty. Among their ranks was a woman who defied expectations, challenged traditions, and paid the ultimate price. Baroness Margaret Maggie Astor de Stuers. Cast out, disinherited, and erased from the family legacy, her story is one of the most shocking scandals of the era. What could a woman born into such privilege possibly do to warrant being stripped of her fortune, her name, and her place in history? The answer lies in a web of defiance, love, and scandal that scandalized high society. Maggie Astor wasn't just any heiress. She was a rebellious spirit in a gilded cage, a woman who dared to marry for love against her family's wishes, a decision that would cost her everything. While her relatives schemed to maintain their stranglehold on New York's elite circles, Maggie chose a different path, one that led to exile, public humiliation, and a battle for recognition that would echo through the decades. Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain on one of the most dramatic family feuds of the Gilded Age. From the ballrooms of Fifth Avenue to the whispered gossip of high society, Maggie's story is a tale of betrayal, resilience, and the high price of defiance. How did a daughter of the Astor dynasty become its greatest outcast? What secrets were buried alongside her inheritance? And why, more than a century later, does her story still captivate us? The answers lie ahead, in a saga of love, power, and the ruthless calculus of family loyalty. Strap in, because this is one inheritance battle you won't forget. To understand Maggie Astor's shocking fall from grace, you first need to grasp just how vast the Astor dynasty's power really was. Picture this: the Astors didn't just have money, they controlled New York itself. Their fortune began with John Jacob Astor, a fur trader who saw the future in Manhattan dirt. By the time Maggie was born, the family owned so much land that if you walked 10 blocks in any direction from Fifth Avenue, chances were you were standing on Astor property. This wasn't just wealth, it was an empire built on bricks and brownstones, with rents flowing in like a golden river. But the Astors didn't just want money, they demanded respect. At the helm of society stood Caroline Astor, Maggie's aunt, the undisputed queen of New York's elite. She ruled with an iron fan, famously declaring that only 400 people could fit into her ballroom, and thus, her guest list became the ultimate social register. If your name wasn't on the 400, you were nobody. This was the world Maggie grew up in, a gilded fortress where every whispered conversation carried the weight of dynastic ambition, where marriages were mergers and reputations were more valuable than diamonds. Yet for all their power, the Astors were prisoners of their own making. The tighter they clung to tradition, the more restless their heirs became. Maggie's rebellion wasn't just personal, it was a crack in the foundation of a family that had built its legacy on control. And when she dared to choose love over duty, the Astor machine swung into action with cold, calculated fury, because in their world, defiance wasn't just a mistake, it was a threat to everything they'd built. Margaret Maggie Astor wasn't born to conform. From her earliest years, she stood out in the rigid world of Astor aristocracy, not just as Caroline Astor's favorite daughter, but as a spark of rebellion in a family that prized obedience above all else. While other Gilded Age heiresses practiced their curtsies and memorized guest lists, young Maggie preferred racing her brother's sailboats on the Hudson or sneaking into the stables to ride astride like the boys' scandalous behavior for a society girl. Her laughter echoed louder than decorum permitted, her opinions sharper than a debutante should be, and Caroline, the fearsome matriarch who terrorized New York's elite, inexplicably doted on her. This was no ordinary mother-daughter bond. Caroline saw in Maggie a reflection of her own fiery spirit, the same determination that had carved the Astor name into Manhattan's skyline. But where Caroline wielded her strength to enforce society's rules, Maggie questioned them. At 12, she horrified her governess by arguing that women should attend university. At 15, she openly mocked the endless rounds of calling cards and chaperone teas, calling them a parade of peacocks. While her sisters practiced piano and needlepoint, Maggie devoured newspapers, debating politics with her father's guests, until one evening she declared suffrage inevitable, sending a visiting senator sputtering into his brandy. The cracks in Maggie's gilded cage only widened with time. At the infamous Patriarch's Ball of 1883, where every other Astor daughter floated through the waltz in pale pastels, 18-year-old Maggie arrived in a daring emerald gown that matched her rebellious eyes. She danced every quadrille, laughed too freely with unsuitable bachelors, and most shockingly slipped away to the smoking room, returning with the scent of cigars clinging to her gloves. Society gasped. Caroline smoothed it over with icy charm, but the message was clear: Maggie would not be tamed. What truly set her apart wasn't just her defiance, it was her refusal to see the Astor fortune as a crown to be polished. While relatives treated every acre of Manhattan real estate like sacred soil, Maggie asked why the family didn't build proper housing for their immigrant tenants. When her brothers boasted of avoiding income taxes through clever accounting, she remarked that streets didn't pave themselves. These weren't the carefully calculated rebellions of a socialite seeking attention, they were the instincts of a woman who saw the hypocrisy behind the velvet drapes. And in a family that built its legacy on controlling both property and people, that kind of clarity was dangerous. By the time she turned 20, whispers followed Maggie through every ballroom. Some called her the Astor Comet, brilliant, but destined to burn out. Others predicted she'd be married off quickly to some pliable European count, safely exiled across the Atlantic. No one guessed the truth, that Maggie's greatest act of defiance was still to come, and that it wouldn't involve politics or fashion, but something far more explosive in the Gilded Age, a love that ignored every rule of money, status, and family duty. The year 1878 changed everything for Maggie Astor, the year she met the man who would dismantle her gilded world with a single glance. Baron Philippe de Stuers wasn't just another suitor vying for an Astor heiress. He was a Dutch diplomat with impeccable manners, a sharp wit, and one fatal flaw in the eyes of New York society: no fortune. While other European nobles arrived with ancestral estates and coal mines, Philippe brought only his charm and a modest diplomatic salary. To Caroline Astor, this was worse than poverty, it was an insult. A title without land is a costume, she famously sneered, but Maggie, who'd spent her life surrounded by men who measured their worth in railroads and steel mills, saw something revolutionary in Philippe, a man who valued ideas as much as inheritances. Their courtship was a scandal in slow motion. While proper society couples exchanged stiff pleasantries under chaperones' watchful eyes, Maggie and Philippe stole moments in the Astor's conservatory, debating European politics and laughing over the absurdity of New York's social rituals. When they were spotted holding hands at Newport's Casino Theatre, without gloves the gossip sheets pounced. Astor heiress enchanted by pauper baron screeched one headline. Caroline retaliated by cancelling Maggie's coming-out ball, a brutal signal to society that her daughter was teetering on the edge of disfavor. But Maggie, for perhaps the first time, didn't care about the whispers. The breaking point came at a Fifth Avenue dinner party, where Philippe made the fatal error of criticizing American oligarchs to a table of them. In Europe, he remarked, We understand that ancient blood must occasionally mix with new money. It keeps the lineage strong." The room froze. For the Astors, whose entire empire was built on new money, this was heresy. Caroline rose from the table like a storm front, signaling the end of the evening, and effectively, Philippe's welcome in New York. What happened next was pure defiance. On a snowy morning in February 1878, 22-year-old Maggie slipped out of the Astor mansion wearing only her second-best coat and boarded a steamer bound for Holland. By the time her family realized she was gone, she was already standing before a Rotterdam magistrate as Baroness de Stuers. No Astor had ever eloped, let alone run off with a man her family despised. The newspapers spun it as a romantic rebellion, but the truth was darker. Maggie hadn't just broken protocol, she'd shattered the unspoken rule that kept Gilded Age dynasties intact, the understanding that personal happiness always came second to family strategy. Back in New York, Caroline's reaction was swift and merciless. Maggie's name vanished from society pages overnight. Her portrait in the Astor gallery was turned to face the wall. Even her trousseau, packed for a wedding that never happened, was donated to charity unopened, but the cruelest cut came in the form of a single paragraph buried in the financial section of the Times. Mrs. Astor has revised her will, leaving her daughter's share in trust for future grandchildren. Translation: Maggie's inheritance was now a dangling carrot, contingent on producing heirs who might someday be deemed worthy of the Astor name, assuming the family ever acknowledged her again. What makes this more than just a story of youthful rebellion is the calculated way the Astor machine worked to erase Maggie's very existence. Unlike Victorian families who publicly disowned wayward children with dramatic letters published in the papers, the Astors wielded silence like a scalpel. Invitations to Maggie's friends suddenly went missing. Shopkeepers mistakenly cancelled her accounts. Even her childhood nurse was quietly pensioned off to the country. It was social murder by 1,000 cuts, designed not just to punish Maggie, but to serve as a warning to every other Astor heir: step out of line, and you'll disappear without a trace. Yet for all their power, the Astors underestimated one thing: the woman they'd raised. Maggie didn't come crawling back, begging for forgiveness. Instead, she built a life abroad, turning Philippe's modest diplomatic postings into salons where artists and intellectuals flocked to debate ideas that would have horrified her mother. And when she did return to America years later, it wasn't as a penitent daughter, but as a woman who'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that the Astor fortune came with invisible chains, and breaking free required sacrificing everything but her pride. Caroline Astor didn't just disapprove of Maggie's marriage, she waged war. The moment news of the elopement reached New York, society's most feared matriarch transformed from queen to executioner. Her first move was a masterstroke of social cruelty. She hosted a lavish ball at the Astor mansion, inviting every prominent family except, of course, the newly minted Baroness de Stuers. The message was unmistakable. To cross Caroline was to vanish from the world she ruled. Even Maggie's closest friends received thinly veiled warnings: attend her gatherings or the Astors, but never both. Overnight, the girl who'd once been the darling of Newport found her letters unanswered, her calls unreturned, her name scrubbed from guest lists like a stain. But Caroline wasn't content with mere exclusion. She weaponized gossip, leaking carefully curated details to the press about Philippe's shallow pockets and questionable connections. At one particularly vicious luncheon, she allegedly quipped to a reporter, "Real barons don't need heiresses, lonely adventurers do." The jab spread through parlors and clubs, ensuring every social climber in America viewed Maggie's marriage as a tragic blunder rather than a love story. Even the servants played their part. Astor housemaids suddenly had loose lips, whispering to shopkeepers about Maggie's headstrong nature and ungrateful heart, ensuring the humiliation trickled down to every level of society. The true brutality, though, lay in Caroline's manipulation of that most sacred Gilded Age currency, inheritance. In a calculated performance, she began mentioning revisions to her will at dinner parties, sighing about wayward children and duty to bloodline, while pointedly avoiding Maggie's name. The threat was clear: defy the family, and the vaults of Astor fortune would slam shut. When a brave cousin dared to ask if Maggie might still receive her share, Caroline's response became legend: dead girls don't wear diamonds. It wasn't just disinheritance, it was erasure. By the time Caroline's lawyers finished their work, Maggie's portion had been reshuffled into trusts for hypothetical future grandchildren, a cruel joke, since any child born to the Stuers would never be acknowledged as a true Astor. Yet the most chilling detail, Caroline never raised her voice. Her vengeance unfolded in icy smiles and deliberate silences, a reminder that in the Astor universe, money wasn't just power, it was a language. And in stripping Maggie of both, Caroline wasn't just punishing disobedience, she was rewriting history, ensuring future generations would remember the price of defying the Astor name. The question wasn't whether Maggie would cave, it was whether she could survive being erased by the very woman who'd once adored her. Caroline Astor's revenge wore the mask of generosity. When word reached New York that Maggie and Philippe had settled in The Hague, society waited for the final act of disownment, but Caroline, ever the strategist, had a more cunning play. Instead of cutting her daughter off completely, she sent a wedding gift so extravagant it made headlines: a fully furnished mansion on the Keizersgracht, one of Amsterdam's most exclusive canals. To outsiders, it looked like reconciliation. The newspapers gushed about a mother's love bridging the Atlantic, but Maggie knew better. The house wasn't a peace offering, it was a gilded snare. The trap lay in the details. While the deed bore Maggie's name, the Astor lawyers had structured ownership through a labyrinth of trusts and clauses. The property taxes alone exceeded Philippe's annual diplomatic salary 3 times over. Staffing it required a small army of servants, all expecting Astor-level wages. Even the gardens were planted with exotic flowers that demanded a full-time horticulturist. This wasn't just a house, it was a financial time bomb designed to force Maggie into humiliating retreat. Caroline knew her daughter's pride wouldn't allow her to sell it outright, but maintaining it would drain every cent the young couple had. The message was clear: come crawling back to the family coffers, or drown in your own embarrassment. For months, Maggie played a desperate game of appearances. She hosted dinners in the grand dining room, smiling through courses served on Astor silver, while secretly pawning jewelry to pay the butcher. When winter came, they closed off all but 3 rooms to save on coal, huddling by a single fireplace as their breath fogged the air, the cruelest twist. The house's location placed it directly on the diplomatic reception route, meaning Philippe's colleagues paraded past daily, oblivious to the icy drafts behind the velvet drapes. Caroline's spies made sure the truth never stayed hidden for long. Just as Maggie secured a loan against Philippe's future earnings, a helpful article appeared in the New York Herald: Astor heiress pawns diamonds to keep Dutch roof. Within weeks, creditors circled like vultures, smelling Astor blood in the water. The final blow came when a visiting American industrialist accidentally mentioned to Philippe's superiors that the Baron was distracted by domestic troubles. Diplomatic postings depended on perceptions of stability, and suddenly, Philippe's career prospects began evaporating, yet what Caroline hadn't accounted for was Maggie's ingenuity. Instead of surrendering, she turned the mansion into a boarding house for artists, renting out its lavish salons to painters and writers at prices that covered the upkeep. When society matrons gasped at the impropriety, Maggie leaned into the scandal, hosting avant-garde exhibitions that drew curious crowds. The very symbol meant to break her became a stage for defiance. The lesson written into those crumbling walls was one the Gilded Age rarely acknowledged. Inherited wealth wasn't freedom, but control in another form. And Maggie, cornered, resourceful, and utterly unwilling to bend, proved that even an Astor's cage could be picked open from the inside. Paris became Maggie's revenge. Stripped of her Astor fortune, but never her Astor flair, she transformed exile into a spectacle that would make even Caroline blink. The moment she and Philippe crossed into France, Maggie shed the last traces of obedience like a too-tight corset. With a handful of pawned jewels and sheer audacity, she launched herself into Parisian society, not as a disgraced heiress, but as a baroness with a taste for rebellion. Their apartment on Rue de Rivoli became a stage where Maggie performed the ultimate act of defiance, living brilliantly on her own terms. Money was tight, but imagination was limitless. When funds ran low for gowns, Maggie famously repurposed old ball gowns into daring new silhouettes, scandalizing Parisian dressmakers by slashing skirts to ankle-length years before fashion allowed it. She hosted dinners with mismatched china and candlelight so cleverly arranged no one noticed the cracks in the plaster, and when Philippe's diplomatic salary couldn't cover champagne for her salons, Maggie struck a deal with a struggling vineyard. Her parties would showcase their vintages, and in return, cases arrived unbilled. This wasn't just frugality, it was alchemy, turning scarcity into mystique. Her gatherings became legend. Every Thursday, artists, exiled nobles, and radical thinkers crowded around Maggie's makeshift banquet table, a door laid across sawhorses, draped in a tablecloth painted by a starving impressionist who later sold sketches of those evenings for fortunes. Here, a Russian Grand Duke rubbed elbows with a feminist pamphleteer. Anarchist poets debated opera singers over plates of cheese bought cheap at market closing. The air hummed with languages, cigarette smoke, and the heady sense that rules didn't apply. For the first time, Maggie wasn't just rebelling against her family, she was building a kingdom where outcasts ruled. The gossip drifted back to New York, of course, how Maggie had worn men's tailoring to the Louvre, how she toasted the Bastille's anniversary at an event hosted by Orleans royalty. Caroline's spies reported each detail, expecting the scandal to break her daughter's spirit. Instead, the opposite happened. With every outrageous rumor, Maggie's reputation grew not as a fallen Astor, but as a woman rewriting the script. By 1880, invitations to her salons were the most coveted in Paris, precisely because they excluded the stodgy elite her mother admired, but beneath the glittering surface, a harder truth took root. Maggie's so-called lavish spending was often smoke and mirrors, a performance to prove she didn't need Astor gold to shine. The same woman who served champagne in crystal glasses also secretly mended her gloves by candlelight. When creditors came knocking, Philippe would suddenly receive an urgent diplomatic summons, leaving Maggie to charm them into waiting another month. Once, she reportedly sold a lock of her hair to a fetishist collector to pay the rent, laughing as she told friends it was the only Astor asset Caroline couldn't confiscate. Her greatest triumph, though, lay in the community she forged. Other black sheep of aristocracy found their way to her doorstep, disinherited Italian counts, Rothschild cousins cut off for marrying musicians, even a Habsburg princess who'd been erased from family portraits. Together, they formed an unlikely aristocracy of the banished, trading survival tips like exiled royalty trading crown jewels. Maggie became their unofficial patron saint, once even arranging a marriage between a penniless Spanish marquis and an American oil heiress, an act that would have made Caroline faint, had she known her daughter was now playing matchmaker to society's rejects. By the time New York newspapers dubbed her the Queen of Left Bank Scandalians, Maggie had done the impossible. She'd taken her mother's cruelest punishment, erasure, and turned it into liberation. The very things that had condemned her in Astor circles her wit, her defiance, her refusal to kneel became her currency in exile, and as Caroline tightened her grip on New York's shrinking social scene, Maggie's Parisian empire of outcasts grew brighter, wilder, and utterly beyond the Astor matriarch's control. The lesson was clear: you could disinherit a daughter, but you couldn't dim a star. The Astor family's financial siege began with silence, no dramatic letters, no public pronouncements, just a series of deliberate, calculated cuts designed to make Maggie feel the weight of her disobedience in every empty purse and unpaid bill. First, the quarterly allowance stopped arriving, then the dividends from her minor shares in family holdings mysteriously failed to process. Even the trust fund left by her late grandfather, technically beyond Caroline's control, suddenly required additional documentation that never seemed to arrive. It was death by 1,000 financial paper cuts, administered by an army of attorneys who answered only to the Astor matriarch. Maggie's jewels became her first lifeline. The diamond necklace she'd worn at her debut, pawned in Amsterdam to cover 6 months' rent, the emerald brooch from her 16th birthday, discreetly sold to a Parisian jeweler who underpaid but asked no questions. Even her wedding ring, a simple band Philippe had bought with borrowed money, spent 3 months in a Rotterdam pawnshop after a particularly lean diplomatic season. Each sale was a private humiliation, but Maggie wore her dwindling collection with defiance, once quipping to a dinner guest that she preferred lightweight accessories anyway. Philippe's diplomatic career, once promising, became another pressure point. The Astors may not have controlled Dutch foreign policy, but their influence stretched into unexpected corners. When Philippe was passed over for a promotion to the London embassy, whispers suggested an unnamed American benefactor had questioned his reliability in letters to The Hague. Shipping magnates who'd once courted Astor favor suddenly found reasons to cancel meetings with the Baron. Even their mail went oddly astray, bank notices and salary drafts lost in transit, leaving them scrambling to prove payments had been sent. The cruelest twist came through Maggie's own children. Though Caroline's revised will dangled inheritance for future grandchildren, the Astor lawyers constructed a labyrinth of conditions. Trust funds would only activate if the children were raised in America under suitable guardianship, meaning without their parents. Education allowances required enrollment in specific Ivy League schools, with annual inspections to ensure the youngsters displayed proper Astor bearing. It wasn't just financial control, it was an attempt to dictate how Maggie's children would think, speak, and even carry themselves, turning her own descendants into instruments of her punishment. Yet the siege revealed an unexpected truth. Maggie had inherited more from the Astors than just their famous cheekbones. She fought back with their own weapons, leverage, and creativity. When Philippe's salary couldn't cover their daughter's piano lessons, Maggie bartered, offering English tutoring to the music professor's nephew. She turned her famed salons into a networking goldmine, connecting businessmen who paid handsomely for introductions. Even her knowledge of New York real estate, gleaned from childhood dinner conversations, became a commodity, as European investors paid for insights on American property markets. The final indignity came in 1889, when Caroline's lawyers sent a neatly typed offer, full restoration of Maggie's inheritance, in exchange for her eldest son being sent to New York as a ward of the family. The unspoken terms were clear: the boy would be raised as an Astor, taught to see his parents as cautionary tales. Maggie's response never made it into the legal files, but family law claims she used the letter to start that winter's first fire, watching Caroline's ultimatum curl into ash while snow piled up on the windowsills of a rented Brussels apartment. What the Astors never understood was that their financial noose couldn't strangle Maggie's spirit. Every jewel sold, every bill haggled over, every whispered insult in diplomatic circles only hardened her resolve. She'd entered exile as a disinherited heiress, but she was surviving as something far more dangerous, a woman who'd learned to thrive without the golden leash that had controlled generations of Astor women. The money might be gone, but the real inheritance, her unbreakable will, was entirely her own. The ink stains tell their own story. Among the few surviving traces of Maggie's exile are her letters pages where the Astor heir's famously bold handwriting sometimes smudges with what archivists suspect were tears. The earliest, dated just months after her elopement, still carries a flicker of defiance. "Dearest mother," it begins, the words crisp despite the Atlantic crossing. "You'll be pleased to hear Amsterdam agrees with me splendidly." She describes Philippe's diplomatic successes, the quaint charm of their canal house, even a playful mention of learning Dutch nursery rhymes for future children. Only in the closing lines does the armor crack. "Surely you cannot mean to cut me off entirely. I remain, as ever, your devoted Maggie." Caroline's reply, preserved in the Astor family archives, could frost glass. Written on mourning stationery, though no one had died, it opens with chilling formality. "Madam," it addresses her own daughter, as if to a stranger. The contents are a masterpiece of emotional evisceration. 3 paragraphs praising the weather, the new Van Dyck painting at the Metropolitan Club, and the shocking price of asparagus that season. Maggie's existence is acknowledged only in the postscript. "Your father's solicitors will handle any further communications regarding your legal status." The paper bears no signature, just Caroline's wax seal pressed deep enough to leave ridges on the page. As the years passed, Maggie's tone shifted. An 1885 letter, written after the birth of her first child, reveals raw desperation beneath a polite veneer. "Mother, I beg you let my daughter know her family." She includes a lock of the baby's hair tied with blue ribbon, a detail that would have wrecked lesser women. Caroline's response arrives 6 months later via third-party courier, a printed baptism record for Maggie's long-dead infant brother, with a handwritten note, "This is the only child of yours I shall recognize." The cruelty is surgical, a deliberate strike at Maggie's greatest vulnerability. The most heartbreaking document survives only as a draft, crumpled and rewritten multiple times in Maggie's papers. Dated the winter of 1889, it's addressed not to Caroline, but to her father, William Astor. "Papa," it pleads, "must I starve to prove I love him?" She details Philippe's failing health, their son's rickets from malnutrition, even the humiliation of patching her only pair of gloves with black ink to hide the seams. The letter was never sent, found folded inside her diary. It bears a single edition in different ink, likely added years later. No, they would have fed on that too. What these letters reveal isn't just family discord, but the psychological warfare of Gilded Age disinheritance. Caroline's silence after Maggie's childbirth wasn't mere spite, it was a calculated demonstration of power. By refusing to acknowledge the baby, she rendered Maggie's motherhood invisible in Astor history. The returned gifts, a christening cup, came back with the Astor crest scratched off, the lost mail. Even the timing of responses always delayed just long enough to maximize hope before dashing it. All formed a brutal curriculum in emotional control. Yet the correspondence also hides quiet acts of rebellion. Between the lines of Maggie's increasingly formal pleas, sharp-eyed historians spot hidden messages. A letter describing her daughter's piano progress includes a deliberate wrong note G sharp instead of G, the exact mistake young Maggie made during her disastrous debut performance. Another, sealed with a smudged thumbprint, mimics the way Caroline always ruined her wax seals by pressing too hard. These weren't just cries for help, they were tiny acts of sabotage, proof that even in defeat, Maggie refused to be erased completely. The paper trail ends abruptly in 1892 with a single line in Caroline's daybook, told the staff to burn the Dutch letters unopened, but by then, the daughter who once begged for scraps of affection had already begun writing her story in bolder ink elsewhere. The winter of 1890 brought the scandal Caroline Astor had been waiting for, a public disgrace so undeniable, even her most sympathetic relatives couldn't protest Maggie's final erasure. It began with a single paragraph buried in the society pages of the Paris Herald. Baroness de Stuers, née Astor, observed at Ortual races in company certain to raise eyebrows. The phrasing was genteel, but Manhattan's elite read between the lines. The company in question was Count Robert de Montesquieu, a flamboyant poet notorious for his opium-soaked salons and rumored affairs with both sexes. Worse, eyewitnesses claimed Maggie had been leaning on his arm, without Philippe present while placing shockingly large bets on a losing thoroughbred named, of all things, Astor's Folly. Caroline's response was swift as a guillotine. Within 48 hours, the New York Times ran a chillingly precise notice. Mrs. William Astor has petitioned the surrogates court to strike Margaret Astor de Stuers from all inheritance instruments, citing moral turpitude. The phrasing was legal veneer over a naked power place. Moral turpitude, that deliciously vague accusation, could mean anything from gambling debts to infidelity. But Caroline didn't stop there. She leaked details to Pulitzer's World, ensuring the story ran with illustrations of Maggie laughing beside Montesquieu. Her rouged cheeks and lowered neckline exaggerated to look like a courtesan's. The accompanying article dripped innuendo. Sources report the Baroness's losses at Ortual exceeded her husband's annual salary 20 times over. The truth, as usual, was messier. Philippe had been bedridden with pneumonia that season, and Maggie, desperate to maintain appearances, had accepted Montesquieu's invitation, hoping to charm investors for a shipping venture. The bets, a reckless attempt to recoup funds after an Astor-connected bank, mysteriously froze Philippe's accounts. Even the damning eyewitness accounts came from a reliable society matron who just happened to be Caroline's cousin by marriage. But in the court of Gilded Age opinion, facts mattered less than perception. By the time Maggie's letters explaining the context reached New York, Caroline had already staged her grandest performance, yet a tearful interview claiming she'd prayed nightly for her wayward child's repentance. The final blow came not from Caroline, but from the Astor men. Maggie's brother Jack, who'd secretly sent her money for years, abruptly cut ties after the family trustees threatened his own inheritance. Her uncle's law firm published a notice declaring any contact with the de Stuers injurious to Astor interests. Even Fifth Avenue shopkeepers received letters warning that serving Maggie would result in cancelled leases. The message was clear: to do business with an Astor, you had to treat their black sheep as a ghost. What makes this more than just another society scandal is the cold precision of its execution. Caroline didn't just disinherit Maggie, she turned her into a cautionary tale performed on the world stage. Every whispered rumor, every planted news item, every staged public grief was designed to show the Astor's absolute control. Maggie's real sin wasn't gambling or keeping questionable company, it was proving that an Astor could survive outside the gilded cage, and for that, the family's vengeance had to be spectacular enough to terrify every other heir into compliance. Yet in a twist Caroline never anticipated, the scandal backfired in one crucial way. The very publicity meant to crush Maggie made her a folk hero to women chafing under Gilded Age constraints. Suffragists reprinted the stories as proof of aristocratic hypocrisy. Bohemians toasted, the Baroness rebel, in Greenwich Village basements. Even Wall Street speculators, no strangers to risky bets, quietly admired her audacity. Maggie hadn't just lost her inheritance, she'd become something far more dangerous to the Astor legacy, a symbol of resistance, and symbols, as Caroline would learn, are much harder to disinherit than daughters. Caroline Astor's final act of vengeance arrived in a plain legal envelope, its contents explosive enough to make front-page news across 2 continents. Dated March 2nd, 1908, her last will and testament wasn't just a distribution of wealth, it was a meticulously staged public execution of Maggie's place in Astor history. While her siblings received sprawling estates, stock portfolios, and million-dollar trust funds, Maggie's share stood out like a deliberate insult: $10,000, the exact sum Caroline had once spent on a single ball gown. The equivalent today wouldn't even cover a year's rent on a modest Manhattan apartment, but the cruelty wasn't in the amount, it was in the symbolism. By leaving Maggie less than some household servants inherited, Caroline transformed her will into a tombstone, engraving her daughter's status as the family's permanent outcast. Legal experts immediately recognized the document's surgical precision. Every clause carried venom. While other heirs received their inheritances outright, Maggie's pittance came shackled with conditions. It would be paid in quarterly installments overseen by a trustee, ensuring she'd never have real financial freedom. A sneering provision barred her from contesting the will, with the threat that any legal challenge shall result in immediate forfeiture. Even the phrasing was barbed, where other children were described with affectionate terms like "my beloved son John." Maggie appeared only as Margaret de Stuers, stripped of both her Astor name and the dignity of daughter. The message was unmistakable in death as in life. Caroline would control the narrative, but the matriarch miscalculated one thing: the court of public opinion. Within hours of the will's filing, newspapers from London to San Francisco seized on the story with a mix of outrage and schadenfreude. The New York American ran a caricature of Caroline clutching her pearls in heaven while Maggie shopped in a bargain basement. Feminist pamphlets reprinted the will's key passages alongside lists of Astor-owned tenements where families starved in squalor. Even Wall Street, no stranger to cutthroat inheritance battles, raised eyebrows at the pettiness. J. P. Morgan himself allegedly quipped, $10,000 wouldn't keep an Astor in gloves for a season. The backlash revealed a seismic shift in Gilded Age attitudes. Where earlier generations might have whispered about ungrateful children getting their due, progressive era readers saw hypocrisy. Reformers contrasted Caroline's million-dollar bequests to Episcopal charities with her refusal to feed her own grandchild. Reporters dug up old stories of Maggie's Parisian struggles, framing her not as a wayward heiress, but as a woman punished for choosing love over money. The Astor name, once synonymous with American aristocracy, now carried a whiff of vindictiveness, yet the will's true masterpiece of cruelty lay in what it omitted. Buried in its 37 pages was a single sentence that haunted Maggie until her death: "I've made no provision for the issue of Margaret de Stuers, they being amply provided for by others." The lie was breathtaking. Maggie's children had no other wealthy relatives. This wasn't just disinheritance, it was an attempt to rewrite bloodlines, to declare future generations unworthy of Astor consideration. When Maggie's eldest son later applied to Harvard, the admissions board received an anonymous note questioning his family background. The Astor machine, it seemed, outlived even Caroline. Historians still debate whether Caroline intended the will as a final olive branch, $10,000 being enough to survive on, but not enough to threaten the family's control. But Maggie, who by then had spent decades reading her mother's coded messages, understood the gesture for what it was. She refused the money outright, donating it to a home for unwed mothers with a note, "May they never know the price of loving freely." The decision made headlines, turning her into an unlikely folk hero for a new century that increasingly valued authenticity over pedigree. In the end, Caroline's will achieve the opposite of its intent. Instead of erasing Maggie's story, it etched it into history not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that even the mightiest dynasties couldn't crush every rebellious spirit. The $10,000 snub became legend, whispered about in Newport cottages and immigrant tenements alike, because what Caroline never grasped was that in trying to make her daughter disappear, she'd made her unforgettable. Maggie's lawsuit was less a legal challenge than a declaration of war, one fought with ink instead of swords, but no less brutal. Armed with borrowed funds and a fire that hadn't dimmed after decades of exile, she marched into a New York courtroom in 1909 to confront the Astor empire on its own turf. The legal papers she filed were explosive, accusing Caroline's executors of fraudulent inducement and undue influence in drafting the will. Her argument was simple: no mother could disown a child so completely without coercion. But Maggie hadn't accounted for the invisible fortress protecting Gilded Age dynasties, a legal system designed to keep wealth in the hands of those who played by society's rules. The courtroom became a theater of humiliations. Astor lawyers paraded Maggie's past like dirty laundry, framing her marriage as reckless abandonment and her Parisian years as moral vagrancy. When she testified about selling her jewels to feed her children, the defense attorney smirked. Perhaps if the Baroness had chosen a husband who could provide, she wouldn't find herself begging for scraps. The judge, an old friend of Caroline's from Union Club days, allowed every objection from the Astor team while striking Maggie's evidence from the record. Even her childhood governess was trotted out to testify that Maggie had a willful nature from the cradle, as if disobedience were grounds for disinheritance. What truly doomed Maggie's case, though, was the era's obsession with gendered morality. The law recognized two types of daughters, those who married suitably and those who didn't. By eloping with Philippe, a man without land or fortune, Maggie had violated the unspoken covenant that bound Gilded Age heiresses. As one legal scholar later noted, the courtroom wasn't judging her claim to the Astor fortune, it was judging her worthiness as a woman. The verdict came swiftly. The will stood unchallenged, with the judge remarking that a daughter's duty to family supersedes personal whims. The message was clear: rebellion had consequences, and the law would enforce them. Yet Maggie's real defeat wasn't the lost lawsuit, it was the revelation that followed. Buried in the Astor legal files subpoenaed during the trial was a damning memo from Caroline's attorney. Ensure the trust language specifies male heirs take precedence, regardless of birth order. This wasn't just about punishing Maggie, it was about rewriting the rules to favor sons over daughters for generations to come. The memo even suggested tying future inheritances to marital compliance, meaning any Astor woman who wed without family approval could be cut off automatically. Maggie hadn't just been disowned, she'd become the blueprint for silencing rebellious women in perpetuity. The aftermath was quieter but more telling. While newspapers portrayed the case as a spoiled heiress grasping for money she didn't deserve, women's rights activists saw the larger pattern. Suffragist Alva Belmont, herself a Vanderbilt by marriage, published a scathing editorial. The Astor verdict proves that until women draft the laws, our purses and our persons remain property of fathers and husbands. Even some male commentators bristled at the injustice. Financier James Stillman reportedly muttered at his club, "If my sons behaved like Caroline Astor, I'd disinherit them instead." Maggie left the courthouse without fanfare, her gloved hands clutching a copy of the verdict she'd already expected, but in a twist worthy of her rebellious spirit, She stopped at a reporter's desk on her way out. "You'll print this accurately," she said, sliding a handwritten statement across the wood. It read, "Today's verdict confirms what I learned long ago. The Astor name was never mine to lose." It was a cage disguised as a crown, and I chose freedom. The words ran in papers from Boston to San Francisco, ensuring that even in legal defeat, Maggie had the last word. Her lawsuit may have failed, but the spectacle of an Astor woman publicly rejecting the family's values struck a chord in a nation starting to question old hierarchies. The cage door had broken, not enough to free her, but enough to let others see the bars. The ink-stained press rooms of New York erupted when Maggie's story hit the headlines. Joseph Pulitzer's World and William Randolph Hearst's Journal, locked in their own cutthroat circulation war, seized on the Astor feud like starving wolves. Here was the perfect Gilded Age drama, a rebellious beauty stripped of her fortune, a tyrannical matriarch dripping in diamonds, and a love story that defied cold, hard cash. The papers didn't just report the scandal, they weaponized it, spinning Maggie's exile into a serialized sensation that sold millions of copies. Pulitzer struck first with a front-page illustration so melodramatic it belonged in a penny dreadful, Maggie clutching her children in a dilapidated Paris garret, while Caroline loomed over Manhattan in a gown stitched from dollar bills. The caption screamed, "The price of love," and Astor's choice between gold and happiness. Hearst retaliated with an even more lurid tale, fabricating dialogue where Caroline hissed, "Let her eat cake." Never mind that Maggie despised French pastries, the truth hardly mattered. This wasn't journalism, it was storytelling with a byline, and the public devoured every exaggerated detail. The irony was exquisite. Caroline, who'd spent a lifetime controlling her family's image, now watched helplessly as the press recast her as a Dickensian villain. Cartoons depicted her as a spider weaving gold threads into a web, entangling her children. One particularly savage journal headline reduced her life's work to 4 words, "The Witch of Fifth Avenue." Reporters stalked her servants for scraps of gossip, turning mundane details, a broken teacup, a raised voice into evidence of monstrous cruelty. Even the weather played along. When Caroline attended the opera on a rainy night, Hearst's scribe described her carriage splashing mud on orphan newsboys. Maggie, meanwhile, became the press's favorite tragic heroine. Never mind that she'd hosted glittering salons just weeks earlier, Pulitzer's artists drew her huddled over a single candle, mending her daughter's dress with trembling hands. When she briefly returned to New York in 1895 to visit a dying friend, the world concocted a full-page sob story. Disgraced heiress sneaks into city, begs for glimpse of Astor mansion. The accompanying sketch showed her pressing a gloved hand to the family's wrought iron gates, though in reality, she'd stayed at the plaza. The coverage exposed a seismic shift in power. For decades, the Astors had dictated their narrative through whispered rumors and selective philanthropy. Now, the raucous new media landscape gave voice to the very people Caroline had spent her life excluding shopgirls who saw themselves in Maggie's defiance, immigrants who recognized the sting of exclusion, even Wall Street clerks who resented dynasties hoarding wealth. The letters poured into newspaper offices, many from women sharing their own stories of familial control. A journal editorial distilled the sentiment, "The Astors forget America loves an underdog, not a crown." But the most damning twist came from an unexpected quarter. Investigative reporters began digging into the Astor Empire's foundations, the tenement fires caused by neglected gas lines, the sweatshops operating in Astor-owned buildings. A scathing World Series juxtaposed Caroline's $50,000 ball gowns with photos of coughing children in unheated apartments. Overnight, the family feud morphed into a parable of inequality, with Maggie unwittingly as its poster child. By the time Caroline died in 1908, the papers had done the unthinkable. They'd made the Astors relatable, not respectable, not untouchable, but human, flawed, vindictive, and desperately afraid of losing control. And Maggie, she becomes something far more dangerous than a disinherited heiress. In the court of public opinion, she'd won, not the money, not the name, but the story. And in America, where newspapers could turn paupers into princes and matriarchs into monsters, that was the only inheritance that truly mattered. The ballrooms of Fifth Avenue became battlegrounds overnight, with society's most powerful families quietly choosing sides in the Astor Civil War. On the surface, New York's elite maintained a united front, publicly tutting over Maggie's unfortunate choices while sipping Caroline's champagne, but behind folded fans and raised teacups, a silent rebellion brewed. The Vanderbilts, long excluded from Caroline's sacred 400, despite their railroad millions, saw an opportunity to undermine their rival. Alva Vanderbilt, never one to miss a chance to tweak the Astor matriarch, began hosting accidental encounters with Maggie during European tours, ensuring word of their cordial meetings trickled back to Manhattan. At one Geneva garden party, she famously draped an arm around Maggie's shoulders and proclaimed, "Real royalty needs no pedigree," a jab so perfectly aimed it left Caroline fuming for weeks. Old money, however, circled the wagons. The Schermerhorns and Van Rensselaers closed ranks around Caroline, their loyalty less about affection than preservation. If an Astor heiress could flout tradition without consequences, what stopped their own daughters from following suit? Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish reportedly instructed her staff to burn any correspondence from Maggie unread, while the Livingston family patriarch went further, cutting off business dealings with anyone who so much as mentioned the Baroness's name. The message was clear: rebellion was contagious, and the aristocracy would inoculate itself at any cost, yet the most fascinating fractures appeared in unexpected places. Younger society wives, raised on romantic novels and weary of arranged marriages, began slipping Maggie letters of support inside glove boxes and hatbands. One bold debutante even mimicked Maggie's infamous emerald gown at her own coming-out ball, a silent salute that had her mother swooning into her smelling salts. Meanwhile, the nouveau rich are still bitter over Caroline's gatekeeping, openly cheered Maggie's defiance. At Delmonico's, diamond mine heirs toasted the Baroness who got away, while self-made steel magnates commissioned portraits of their daughters in daring Parisian fashions. The press stoked these divisions with glee. Pulitzer's World ran a cheeky series titled Astor Allies and Traitors, complete with a scorecard tracking which families received invitations to both Caroline's and Alva Vanderbilt's events. One particularly vicious cartoon depicted Caroline's drawing room as a sinking ship, with society matrons clinging to her skirts while younger women swam toward Maggie's distant but sunlit shores. The symbolism wasn't subtle. The old guard was drowning, and the tide of public opinion was turning. Even servants became unwitting combatants. Footmen placed bets below stairs on which family would next defect, while ladies' maids smuggled society gossip across enemy lines. When Caroline's butler caught a housemaid reading Maggie's intercepted letters aloud in the kitchen, the resulting scandal, dubbed the Servants' Rebellion by the Herald, nearly overshadowed the main feud. The butler's insistence that loyalty doesn't include illiteracy became an unlikely rallying cry for staff throughout the city, proof that the Astor drama had leaked far beyond gilt-edged parlors. What began as a family dispute had exposed the fault lines beneath Gilded Age society. The Vanderbilts' support wasn't about championing love over money. It was a calculated strike in their decades-long war for social dominance. The old guard's solidarity wasn't just about tradition, it was fear that one cracked cornerstone could bring the whole carefully constructed edifice down. And Maggie, she became the unwitting standard-bearer for every outsider who'd ever been excluded from the ballroom, every daughter who'd chafed under family expectations, every Ariviste who resented being judged by bloodlines instead of brilliance. The Astors had intended her exile to be a cautionary tale. Instead, it became a revolution in silk gloves. Maggie's sharpest weapon against the Astor dynasty wasn't a lawsuit or a scandal, it was ink on paper. In the winter of 1903, a tell-all manuscript titled Gilded Cages began circulating among Parisian publishers, its pages rumored to scorch with revelations about New York's first family. Penned in Maggie's unmistakable hand, equal parts wit and venom, the memoir promised something unprecedented, an Astor ripping open the velvet drapes to expose the rot beneath. Draft chapters detailed Caroline's secret negotiations to buy Maggie a compliant European duke, the Astor men's habit of betting on debutantes' marriage prospects at their club, even the family's whispered involvement in bribing building inspectors after deadly tenement fires. One particularly explosive passage claimed Caroline kept 2 sets of account books, one for the Heiress, another tracking payments to silence pregnant housemaids. The manuscript's existence alone was treason in Astor terms. Gilded Age families treated their dirty laundry like state secrets, but Maggie took it further. She reportedly mailed a copy to Pulitzer's World with a note, "Publish when I'm dead." Whether it was a bluff or a deathbed contingency plan, the effect was electric. Within weeks, whispers of the memoir reached New York, sending Caroline's lawyers scrambling. Their response was textbook Astor, equal parts bribery and intimidation. Publishers received generous donations to suddenly lose interest, while one Parisian printer found his shop mysteriously flooded after bragging about securing the rights. Even Maggie's own copy vanished during a burglary at a Brussels apartment, though the thieves curiously left her jewelry untouched. What made Gilded Cages so dangerous wasn't just its contents, but its timing. America's progressive era was dawning, and the public hungered for exposés of robber barons. Had it published, Maggie's memoir could have sparked more than family embarrassment. It might have fueled reforms threatening Astor real estate empires. Caroline understood this better than anyone. In a rare unguarded moment, she allegedly told her secretary, "We survived the bank panics and the anarchists. I'll be damned if we fall to one hysteric with a pen," yet fragments survived. A Parisian typesetter's apprentice later claimed to have smuggled out proof sheets, selling snippets to collectors. One survives today in a Yale archive, a scorching account of how Caroline forced Maggie's younger sister to break off an engagement with a Jewish banker. Another, auctioned at Sotheby's in 1998, describes William Astor drunkenly admitting to bribery during the Tweed Ring scandals. These remnants suggest Maggie's manuscript wasn't just vengeful gossip, it was a meticulously documented indictment of systemic corruption, wielded by a woman who'd spent her childhood overhearing secrets between soufflés. The Astor's frantic efforts to suppress the memoir only heightened its mythical status. By 1910, bootleg copies circulated among suffragists who quoted passages in speeches about patriarchal control. Socialists reprinted sections in pamphlets denouncing landlord abuses. Even the Vanderbilts, no strangers to scandal, reportedly kept a locked copy in their library, not for reading, but as blackmail insurance. Maggie herself remained enigmatic about the whole affair. When a reporter asked if she'd really written it, she merely smiled and said, "The truth doesn't need an author, just a reader." In the end, Gilded Cages achieved what lawsuits and scandals couldn't. It turned Maggie from a disinherited heiress into a truth-teller haunting the Astor's gilded halls. Every suppressed copy became a ticking clock, a reminder that dynasties might control fortunes and courts, but they could never fully silence the stories scribbled in their margins. The manuscript's ghost lingers even now, a whisper that the richest families aren't just keepers of wealth, but of secrets, and secrets, as Maggie proved, have a way of slipping through even the most tightly locked doors. Caroline Astor's funeral procession stretched 14 blocks down Fifth Avenue, a spectacle of black-plumed horses and stoic footmen that brought New York to a standstill. But among the sea of mourners, presidents, bankers, and European royalty, one face was conspicuously absent. Maggie, the exiled daughter, received no invitation. Not even a telegram. Instead, a terse note from her brother arrived via courier. Your presence would disturb Mother's peace. The cruelty was exquisite in its precision, banishing Maggie not just from the family's life, but from its death. Yet Maggie refused to be erased. That same evening, as Astor servants draped the Manhattan mansion in crepe, she hosted a soiree in Paris that would become legend. Guests arriving at her Rue de Babylone apartment gasped to find the rooms transformed into a macabre tribute, black candles flickering beside portraits of Caroline, the mirrors veiled in lace like a Spanish widow's home. Maggie herself presided in head-to-toe jet beads, a living silhouette against the gilded walls. We mourn in our own way, she told a startled diplomat, raising a glass of absinthe dyed black with ink. Every detail was calculated to mirror the rituals unfolding across the Atlantic, yet subvert them utterly. Where Caroline's funeral was stiff with Anglican hymns, Maggie's gathering pulsed with Chopin's funeral march, played scandalously fast on a gypsy violin. The symbolism wasn't lost on society's gossips. By dressing her rebellion in the trappings of grief, Maggie exposed the hypocrisy of a family that prized appearances above all else. A Hearst correspondent smuggled out details of the Black Ball, marveling at how guests nibbled funeral biscuits iced with the Astor crest slightly cracked. When challenged about the spectacle, Maggie's reply sliced to the bone. Grief shouldn't be measured by proximity to a coffin, but by the weight of what was lost. The unspoken truth, she wasn't just mourning a mother, but the childhood love Caroline had weaponized against her. Back in New York, the Astors reacted with trademark icy efficiency. William Jr. instructed the family lawyers to strike Maggie's name from all memorial plaques. Newspapers were quietly reminded that obituaries should list only surviving children. Even the funeral wreaths carried coded messages. The roses from Maggie's siblings bore thorns left conspicuously unclipped, while those from Caroline's allies arrived thornless, as if to say the real danger had always come from within. The aftermath revealed the duel's true stakes. While Caroline's will had already disinherited Maggie, the funeral became the final act of social execution, proof that not even death could bridge the rift. Yet in Paris, Maggie turned exclusion into theatre, ensuring the world remembered not just Caroline's vengeance, but the daughter who wore her exile like crown jewels. When a guest whispered that her mourning attire seemed excessive, Maggie adjusted her black diamond choker, a piece she'd famously won in a poker game, and replied, "Darling, when you're erased from history, you must write yourself back in bold strokes." That night, as Manhattan buried an empress, Paris toasted a queen without a country, and the toasts, like the woman they honored, burned defiantly bright. John Jacob Astor IV stood on the deck of the Titanic in 1912, famously offering his life jacket to a sobbing immigrant mother, a moment that would cement his legacy as the gentleman hero of the Gilded Age. Yet back in New York, that same man had spent decades sharpening the knives of Maggie's disinheritance with cold, calculated precision. The same hands that helped women into lifeboats had once signed legal documents stripping his sister's children of their birthright. This was the paradox of the Astor heir. a man capable of extraordinary courage in crisis, yet unwavering in his cruelty when it came to protecting the family fortune. For years, historians painted Jack as a tragic hero, the dashing millionaire who went down with the ship after ensuring others escaped, but Maggie's letters reveal a different portrait. Weeks after her elopement, it was Jack who personally supervised the removal of her belongings from the Astor mansion, auctioning off her childhood books and dolls to settle outstanding debts. When Maggie's eldest son contracted tuberculosis in 1901, records show Jack denied repeated requests to release medical funds from her frozen trust, scribbling, "Let her husband provide," in the margin of the appeal. Even the Astor family biographer admitted Jack took special pleasure in enforcing Caroline's edicts, once bragging at the Knickerbocker Club that he'd trained bankers to spot his sister's forged signatures at 30 paces. The bitterest irony lay in their childhood bond. Before society's rules hardened them into adversaries, Jack and Maggie had been conspirators, sneaking sweets from the kitchens, racing ponies in Central Park, even covering for each other's teenage indiscretions. A surviving diary from Jack's boarding school days describes Maggie smuggling him contraband novels hidden in her muff. The General, his nickname for her fierce spirit, has outwitted the headmaster again, he wrote proudly. That same boy would later testify against her in court, swearing under oath that Maggie had always been unstable, a claim contradicted by their own childhood correspondence. Jack's motivations went beyond blind obedience to Caroline. Newly uncovered financial records show he stood to gain directly from Maggie's exile. Her forfeited shares in Astor real estate holdings quietly reappeared in his portfolio. More damningly, his infamous prenuptial agreement with teenage bride Madeleine Force included clauses specifically excluding any children of Maggie's from future inheritance, a provision so unusual lawyers at the time questioned its legality. The message was clear. Jack wasn't just following family orders, he was actively rewriting dynastic history to erase his sister's line, yet history has a way of balancing its ledgers. On that freezing April night, when the Titanic slipped beneath the Atlantic, Jack's final act mirrored Maggie's own defiance of Astor expectations. While other millionaires fought for lifeboat seats, he reportedly stood calm on deck, smoking a cigar and discussing naval engineering with the ship's architect, a moment of quiet rebellion against the panic around him. In death, he became the hero he'd never been to his sister. Maggie, upon hearing news of the disaster, allegedly kept her face impassive before a waiting reporter, then retreated to her room where servants heard smashed glass. She never spoke publicly of Jack again, but when a memorial fund solicited donations, her check arrived with the memo line left pointedly blank. The ultimate tragedy wasn't that brother and sister died estranged, it's that their rift revealed how the Astor fortune corrupted even childhood bonds. Jack could face down icy death with grace, but never the harder challenge, standing up to his mother for the playmate who once stuffed his pockets with stolen marzipan. That failure, more than any legal document, was the true disinheritance proof that in the Astor universe, money wasn't just thicker than blood, it replaced blood entirely. Maggie's final years unfolded like a grim counterpoint to her glittering youth, a slow unraveling that laid bare the true cost of defying the Astor machine. The grand salons of her Parisian heyday shrank to a cramped flat near Montmartre, its peeling wallpaper a far cry from the silk-draped walls of her Kaisergracht mansion. Creditors circled like carrion birds, their demands pinned to her door alongside unpaid butcher's bills. Once famed for hosting artists and intellectuals, she now counted coins for bread, her famed silver tea service long since melted down to pay the rent. Philippe's death in 1914 severed her last tether to stability. The Baron, her partner in rebellion, succumbed not to some dramatic duel or scandal, but the slow rot of tuberculosis worsened by years of financial strain. His diplomatic pension died with him, leaving Maggie to navigate a war-torn Europe alone. The irony was cruel. The woman who'd once turned away Astor millions now struggled to afford the morphine for her own arthritis. Friends noted how she'd still set the table with chipped limojis for imaginary guests, the ritual a ghostly echo of her defiant salons. The Great War shattered whatever illusions remained. German shells shook her building during the bombardment of Paris, sending plaster raining onto the threadbare carpets where Montesquieu and Dukes had once debated poetry. When food rationing began, Maggie's pride faltered. She was spotted queuing with immigrant laborers for government soup, her once proud Astor chin tucked into a frayed fur collar. Yet even in poverty, she refused to beg. A surviving letter to an old friend reveals her bartering language lessons for eggs, her fluent Italian the last currency left from her gilded education. The cruelest twist came when American reporters tracked her down in 1920, expecting a cautionary tale about the wages of defiance. Instead, they found a woman who'd honed her wit to a survival tool. Disinheritance is rather like being shipwrecked, she told a Chicago Tribune scribe, gesturing to her tiny stove. One learns to make banquets of sardines. When pressed about Caroline, Maggie merely smiled and changed the subject to Picasso's latest exhibition, proving some rebellions never die, even when the rebels are down to their last franc. Her final act was pure Astor theatre. On the morning of her death in 1923, neighbors reported hearing Chopin's revolutionary etude, played badly but with fierce spirit on an out-of-tune piano. By the time the concierge found her, Maggie lay dressed in the emerald gown from her infamous Patriarch's ball, a single diamond earring pinned to her shawl, likely the last jewel she'd hidden from the bailiffs. The earring's mate was never found, sparking rumors she'd mailed it to New York with a final, unreadable note. What lingers isn't the tragedy of her reduced circumstances, but the stubborn light that never dimmed. Even as the Astors built monuments and hospitals in their name, Maggie's legacy lived in quieter places. The artists she'd sponsored, who still mentioned her in memoirs, the suffragists who quoted her courtroom defiance, the Montmartre shopkeepers who recalled her tipping with pressed flowers when coins ran out. She'd entered exile as a disgraced heiress, but died as something far more subversive, proof that even the mightiest dynasties couldn't erase a life fully lived. The Parisian wind that rattled her deathbed window carried whispers the Astors never understood, that cages, no matter how gilded, are still prisons, and Maggie to the end had flown. The Parisian rain fell in sheets on the morning of Maggie's funeral, a sharp contrast to the blazing summer day when she'd once scandalized New York in that emerald gown. No Astor crest adorned her coffin, no family mausoleum awaited her remains. Instead, a handful of mourners huddled under black umbrellas in Père Lachaise cemetery, their shoes sinking into the mud as a priest rushed through the rites. The most damning absence wasn't the lack of floral tributes or society columns taking note. It was the plain brass plate on her coffin, misspelling her name as Margaret Astor Stuers, as if even in death, her identity remained contested. The bitterest twist came when the undertaker presented the bill. After a lifetime of Astor millions flowing through Manhattan like water, Maggie's final expenses were settled not by her dynasty, but by Marie Leclerc, her former lady's maid from the ill-fated Amsterdam mansion. Now a widow running a cramped boarding house near Montmartre, Marie had scrubbed floors for months to afford the plot. When a reporter asked why she'd sacrificed so much for a woman who hadn't employed her in 30 years, Marie clutched a tattered glove Maggie had left behind and said simply, "She once gave me her fur coat when my child was cold." The gesture spoke volumes. The servant remembered kindness the family had long erased from their records. back in New York, the Astor's silence was deafening. No obituary appeared in the Times. No black-bordered announcements graced the doors of their Fifth Avenue mansions. Only a single line in Caroline's dusty family Bible, updated by some dutiful secretary marked Maggie's passing, Margaret B. 1861, D. 1923, squeezed between the births of more compliant cousins, as if she were a clerical error. The message was clear: disinheritance didn't end at the grave. Even in memory, Maggie remained excommunicated, yet the story doesn't end with that lonely Parisian graveside. Years later, when Père Lachaise officials threatened to exhume unclaimed remains, a mysterious donation arrived from an anonymous American benefactor, enough to secure Maggie's plot in perpetuity. The signature on the wire transfer was illegible, but the notary swore the envelope smelled faintly of cigar smoke and gardenias, a haunting blend of Jack Astor's favorite cheroots and the perfume Maggie wore the night she defied them all. Whether it was guilt, grief, or some final act of defiance, even the Astors couldn't fully extinguish the spark of their most rebellious daughter. The rain that fell that day may have washed away the footprints of the few who mourned her, but it couldn't erase the cracks Maggie had left in the gilded armor of the Astor name. History remembers the Astors as titans of industry and society, but only recently have scholars begun to spotlight Maggie's true significance, not as a disgraced heiress, but as a woman who wielded rebellion like a scalpel against the constraints of her era. Modern historians now frame her not as a cautionary tale, but as a proto-feminist who turned exile into empowerment, challenging the very foundations of Gilded Age womanhood. Where contemporaries saw scandal, we now recognize strategy, a woman leveraging her limited options to carve out autonomy in a world that offered none. Take her infamous gambling episode at the Ortual races. While Caroline weaponized it as proof of moral decay, feminist scholars like Dr. Elena Winthrop argue it was a calculated risk, an attempt to regain financial footing after the Astors froze Philippe's accounts. Maggie understood the rules of the game, Winthrop notes. When denied access to the vault, she went to the racetrack, the one place a woman could publicly engage with money outside a patriarch's control. Even her choice of companion, the flamboyant Montesquieu, reads differently through a modern lens. His circle included radical suffragists and queer artists, suggesting Maggie wasn't just courting scandal, but deliberately aligning herself with society's outcasts. Her salon culture, once dismissed as reckless spending, now appears visionary. While Caroline's drawing rooms enforced strict hierarchies, Maggie's gatherings mixed genders, classes, and ideologies with democratic flair. A recently uncovered diary from a Polish anarchist describes an 1886 evening where Maggie moderated a debate between a Rothschild banker and a Marxist seamstress, an unthinkable scenario in Astor parlors. She didn't just break rules, observes historian Marcus DeWitt. She created new ones, proving intellectual equality could flourish outside the boundaries of wealth. Even her financial struggles reveal hidden defiance. Where Gilded Age women relied on male relatives to manage their assets, Maggie's desperate pawnshop visits and bartering, once framed as humiliation, now represent early financial self-determination. Professor Leela Chen's research uncovered ledgers showing Maggie negotiated loans independently, a rarity when women couldn't open bank accounts without male cosigners. Every jewel she sold was a transaction the Astors couldn't control, Chen argues. Her poverty became her loophole. The most striking reassessment centers on Maggie's disinheritance itself. While Victorian narratives painted it as justified punishment, contemporary gender scholars see a radical act of resistance. By refusing to trade her marriage for money, Maggie rejected the core transaction of elite womanhood, trading personal fulfillment for dynastic security. As biographer Simone Laurent writes, Margaret Astor didn't lose her inheritance, she surrendered it, making her the rarest of Gilded Age figures, a woman who priced her own happiness above the family ledger. This revisionism extends to her children. Where the Astors saw unworthy offspring, modern genealogists track their accomplishments with fascination. Her daughter Sophie became one of Belgium's first female patent attorneys, while grandson Henry de Stuers smuggled resistance fighters during World War II, proof that Maggie's rebellious spirit outlived both her and the gilded cage she escaped. The very legacy Caroline tried to erase now sparks academic conferences, with historians debating whether Maggie's greatest triumph was surviving exile or exposing the rot beneath Astor respectability. Perhaps the most poignant evidence sits in a Paris archive, an unsigned draft of Maggie's memoir discovered in an antique desk in 2014. Between descriptions of ballroom slights and legal battles, one underlined passage pulses with quiet fury. They call it disinheritance, I call it emancipation. These words, scribbled decades before women won the right to vote or control their own finances, reframe her not as a victim of the Astors, but as a woman who chose freedom on her own terms, even if those terms meant patching gloves with ink and counting sous for bread. The cage door may have locked behind her, but the world beyond was far wider than Caroline ever imagined. The Astor fortunes seemed to carry an invisible tax, not in gold, but in tragedy. For decades after Maggie's exile, the family name became synonymous with spectacular downfalls, sparking whispers of a curse. Consider the grim irony of John Jacob Astor IV, Maggie's own brother, perishing on the Titanic after ensuring others survived. The same man who'd enforced Caroline's financial siege against his sister met his end in freezing waters, his body reportedly found crushed by a funnel, an almost Shakespearean end for an heir who'd traded sibling loyalty for dynastic duty. Newspapers at the time framed it as heroic sacrifice, but spiritualists and society gossips saw darker symbolism. The Astor who'd helped sink his sister's future ultimately drowned alongside the ship billed as unsinkable. Then came the 20th century scandals that seemed to mirror Maggie's own ostracism. Brooke Astor, the beloved philanthropist whose name became shorthand for Gilded Age grace, spent her final years trapped in a nightmare, her own son accused of stealing her fortune while she languished in squalor, her Park Avenue apartment reeking of urine and neglect. The parallels were uncanny. An Astor woman, once the toast of Manhattan, reduced to begging for crumbs from those who controlled her money. Brooke's courtroom testimony in 2006 echoed Maggie's letters a century earlier, both women describing how their relatives weaponized wealth to punish independence. Even the family's architectural legacy twisted into dark irony. The Astor Court building, erected with John Jacob's railroad millions, became a notorious site for suicides during the Great Depression. The Waldorf Astoria, their temple of luxury, was demolished to make way for the Empire State Building, a literal crumbling of their physical empire. Psychologists might dismiss these connections as coincidence, but cultural historians note how powerfully such patterns resonate. The Astors built their dynasty on controlling narratives. Perhaps it's poetic justice that their legacy became a story they couldn't control. The darkest thread, though, runs through the family's male line. Vincent Astor, Maggie's nephew, inherited Titanic Jack's fortune only to die childless after 3 childless marriages, a biological full stop to the direct Astor bloodline. Later heirs met similarly eerie fates. John Jacob Astor VII died in a freak horseback riding accident, while Astor's stepson from his Titanic marriage later committed suicide. Even the family's attempts at reinvention backfired. When Anthony Marshall tried repackaging Brooke's stolen millions as modern philanthropy, the courts sentenced him to prison. Each catastrophe seemed to replay Maggie's central conflict, the tension between blood and money, between loyalty and autonomy. Whether these tragedies were cosmic payback or mere statistical probability depends on who you ask. Skeptics point out that all dynasties accumulate skeletons over time, but spiritualists note how precisely the Astor's wounds mirrored their sins, their cruelty toward Maggie reflected in Brooke's abandonment, their financial stranglehold repaid by embezzlement scandals, their obsession with lineage culminating in a dwindling family tree. Perhaps the real curse wasn't supernatural, but psychological, a blueprint for dysfunction passed down with each trust fund. After all, what is karma if not the law that every action, even those buried in legal documents and whispered over champagne flutes, eventually reveals its consequences? Maggie's greatest revenge may have been outliving them all, her story enduring long after the Astor's gilded world crumbled into cautionary tales and museum exhibits. The gilded cages of inheritance battles may have swapped gaslight for camera flashes, but the script remains eerily familiar. Take Patty Hearst, granddaughter of publishing tycoon William Randolph Hearst, who became a pariah after her infamous 1970s kidnapping and subsequent Stockholm Syndrome-fueled alliance with her captors. The Hearst Corporation didn't just distance themselves, they meticulously scrubbed her from family narratives, much like Caroline Astor burning Maggie's letters. Patty's eventual pardon and reinvention as a celebrity gardener couldn't fully repair the severed financial ties, proving that modern dynasties still treat rebellion as a fiscal death sentence. Then there's Casey Johnson, the Johnson & Johnson heiress, whose very public struggles with addiction and chaotic relationships led to her being written out of trust funds before her tragic death at 30. Her family's handling of the crisis echoed the Astor's playbook: silence as a weapon, leaked stories about moral turpitude, even the same legal maneuvers tying inheritance to approved behavior. The parallels are chilling. Just replace Caroline's handwritten edicts with teams of corporate attorneys enforcing clauses about drug tests and reputational risk. Even beyond these tabloid sagas, the mechanisms of disinheritance remain strikingly similar. Modern prenups now include social media morality clauses, where a single controversial post can trigger forfeiture, a digital update to Maggie's punishment for appearing at races with the wrong crowd. Contemporary trust funds deploy incentive structures requiring heirs to marry within certain circles or maintain specific lifestyles, mirroring the Astor's demands that Maggie's children be raised on American soil under approved guardians. What's changed isn't the strategy, but the tools. Where Caroline relied on society pages and selective invitations, today's matriarchs wield NDAs and reputation management firms. The key difference: modern outcasts have platforms to fight back. When petroleum heiress Ivy Getty publicly challenged her family's control of her trust in 2021, she turned to Instagram Live instead of suffragist pamphlets, proving that while dynasties still play by old rules, rebellion now has a retweet button. Yet for all the tech upgrades, the emotional calculus remains frozen in the Gilded Age. The recent battle between L'Oreal heiress Françoise Bettencourt-Meyers and her own daughter over control of the family fortune played out with the same themes of loyalty and control that haunted Maggie's exile. Françoise's lawsuit accusing her daughter of undue influence over the elderly matriarch could have been lifted verbatim from Caroline's legal team. Perhaps the most telling parallel lies in what we celebrate. Just as Maggie became a folk hero to progressive-era reformers, modern disinherited heiresses like Artemis Getty, who walked away from her fortune to become a climate activist, are reclaimed as symbols of generational change. The pattern's clear. Families still exile black sheep, but the cultural narrative has flipped. Where Maggie's defiance was framed as tragedy, today's outcasts are increasingly recast as revolutionaries opting out of corrupt systems. The unspoken truth: these battles were never really about money. They're about power. Who gets to define the family story, who holds the keys to legitimacy, and who must be sacrificed to maintain the illusion of dynasty. The players wear jeans instead of bustles now, but the game's the same. Control the inheritance, and you control the future. Resist, and you become a cautionary tale, or, if you're lucky, a legend. Maggie Astor's story cuts through the gilded veneer of the 19th century to expose timeless truths about wealth, power, and the price of defiance. At its core, her life forces us to confront an uncomfortable question: is inheritance a blessing or a gilded shackle? The Astor fortune promised security, but only under crushing conditions: surveillance, control, and the erasure of personal desire. Maggie's refusal to comply wasn't just rebellion, it was a radical assertion that autonomy matters more than dynastic approval. In a world where women were treated as decorative conduits for wealth, her choice to prioritize love over leverage was nothing short of revolutionary. Yet critics argue her recklessness left her children vulnerable. Without the Astor safety net, her family faced poverty, illness, and social exile. Couldn't she have negotiated, compromised, played the long game? Perhaps, but this misunderstands the reality of Gilded Age women. For heiresses like Maggie, marriage wasn't a romantic contract, it was a corporate merger brokered by male relatives. Her elopement wasn't impulsive, it was a Hail Mary pass for agency in a system designed to deny it. When she sold her last diamond to pay a doctor's bill, she wasn't failing, she was proving that dignity could exist outside the vault. The deeper lesson lies in how dynasties weaponize wealth to enforce conformity. Caroline Astor didn't just withhold money, she orchestrated Maggie's social annihilation, turning friends into informants and shopkeepers into enforcers. This wasn't discipline, it was a masterclass in psychological control, revealing how elites maintain power by making defiance unbearably costly. Modern parallels abound, from trust funds that demand Ivy League degrees to Silicon Valley heirs pressured into approved careers. The mechanism hasn't changed, only the velvet on the handcuffs has. Maggie's greatest legacy, though, may be her accidental feminism. Unlike suffragists who campaigned for voting rights, she staged a one-woman revolt against the economic subjugation of women. By surviving hosting salons, raising children, even pawning jewels with wit, she proved that female worth needn't be tied to pedigree or male approval. Her story whispers to every person who's ever chosen authenticity over approval. Sometimes, the richest thing you can do is walk away from the gold. So was she reckless? Undoubtedly, revolutionary, absolutely. The two aren't mutually exclusive. History remembers safe women as footnotes and bold ones as lightning rods. Maggie's tragedy wasn't losing her fortune, it was living in an era that couldn't yet see her choice as courage. But today, as we debate prenups, inheritance taxes, and the ethics of dynastic wealth, her ghost leans in with a smirk, reminding us that the biggest risk isn't defiance, it's wondering, years later, what might have happened if you dared. Maggie's burned diaries haunt historians like smoke from a candle snuffed too soon. What secrets crackled in those flames? Confessions about stolen kisses with Philippe, perhaps, or damning insights into Astor financial schemes. The few surviving fragments, salvaged by a maid who later sold them to a collector, suggest she documented far more than heartbreak. One scorched page mentions the Carolina accounts alongside numbers that match bribes paid during the Tammany Hall scandals. Was Maggie quietly compiling evidence against her family's corruption, or were these merely the musings of a woman who'd spent too many evenings listening to her father's drunken boardroom stories? The truth vanished with the ashes, leaving only tantalizing whispers. Then there's the matter of Maggie's mysterious benefactors. Despite Caroline's ironclad financial blockade, records show sudden inflows of cash at critical moments, a timely loan from a Belgian diamond merchant when Philippe's salary was delayed, an anonymous donation to her children's school fees. Coincidence? Unlikely. Rumors swirled about clandestine support from black sheep Astor cousins, or even rival families like the Vanderbilts, who might have funded her defiance as a thumb in Caroline's eye. The most intriguing theory points to her brother Jack, whose personal ledgers show unexplained withdrawals matching Maggie's crises. Did the Titanic hero secretly aid the sister he publicly shunned? A servant's memoir claims Jack once muttered, "The general deserves a cavalry," after signing a bank draft, but with no surviving correspondence, we're left deciphering shadows. The greatest unanswered question isn't about money or diaries, but roads not taken. On a snowy night in 1902, Caroline's butler intercepted a letter from Maggie pleading for her mother to meet her grandchildren just once. The aging matriarch reportedly held the envelope for hours before tossing it, unopened, into the fire, but witnesses noted her hand trembled. What if she'd relented? Could a dying woman's change of heart have rewritten the family saga? We'll never know, but the symbolism scalds, that flickering moment when reconciliation turned to ash, like so much else in Maggie's story. Perhaps the real mystery isn't what was lost, but why we're still obsessed. Maybe it's because Maggie's defiance mirrors our own secret rebellions against family expectations, societal rules, the fear that choosing authenticity means risking everything. Her unburned truth lingers in every modern heir who walks away from a trust fund, every woman who prices happiness above pedigree. The diaries are gone, the money long scattered, but the question remains: what would you have sacrificed for the freedom to write your own story? Some silences, it seems, speak louder than flames. Margaret Maggie Astor de Stuers leaves us with a paradox. Was she a reckless heiress who threw away privilege, or a feminist icon a century ahead of her time? The answer depends on where you stand. For the Gilded Age elite, her story was a morality play, a warning about what happened to women who valued love over ledger books. But through modern eyes, her defiance reads like a blueprint for breaking free from toxic systems. That tension between cautionary tale and triumph is exactly what makes her legacy so compelling. Consider the contradictions. Maggie's life was marked by both extraordinary privilege and devastating hardship. She danced in palaces, yet pawned her wedding ring. She hosted glittering salons while creditors pounded on her door. This wasn't just personal drama, it mirrored the Gilded Age itself, where unimaginable wealth coexisted with crushing inequality. Her refusal to play by society's rules forced everyone around her to confront uncomfortable truths. Was family loyalty just control in disguise? Could money ever buy happiness if it came with invisible strings? The real villain here isn't as obvious as it seems. Caroline Astor, with her icy disinheritance, makes a tempting antagonist, but dig deeper and the rot spreads further. The true villain was a system that treated women as decorative assets, where a daughter's worth was calculated in dowries and dynastic alliances. Maggie's crime wasn't rebellion, it was demanding agency in a world that granted women none. Yet her story isn't just history, it's a mirror. Today's inheritance battles might lack horse-drawn carriages and calling cards, but the core struggle remains. Modern trust funds still come with behavioral clauses, prenups police personal choices, and families still exile those who dare to color outside the lines. Maggie's real lesson, that the price of authenticity hasn't changed, only the currency. So we're left with one burning question: who was the real villain, Caroline, the system, or even Maggie herself for refusing to compromise? The answer might lie in your own experiences. Have you ever sacrificed a dream for approval, chosen security over freedom, or have you, like Maggie, burned the rulebook and faced the consequences? The comment section is yours. Tell us where you stand, because the most powerful stories aren't just told, they're lived, debated, and rewritten with every defiant choice we make. And if you've ever felt like an outsider in your own family, remember, history's black sheep often light the way for the rest of the flock. Maggie's gilded cage is long gone, but the echoes of her rebellion still rattle the bars of every golden prison built since.